August 14th, 1966. The air was thick enough to drink. Outside the village of Dien Ban, in Quang Nam Province, the sun bore down with a physical weight. It pressed on the shoulders of the rice farmers, baked the cracked earth of the dikes, and shimmered over the emerald green of the paddies. For the men and women working the fields, it was a day like any other day, a day defined by the rhythm of planting, the ache in the lower back, and the constant, gnawing presence of a war that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the noise. It was a low, mechanical growl, unfamiliar and alien in a landscape sculpted by hands and water buffalo. A lone M151 Jeep, caked in the ubiquitous red dust of the region, bounced along the path that served as a road. At the wheel was a young American Marine, not much older than the farmer's own sons. He was a boy from Ohio who had never known a day of true hunger, a boy for whom the world was a place of infinite, predictable supply. The Jeep pulled to a stop. The Marine, his face flushed from the heat, reached into a green cooler, sweating with condensation. He pulled out a glass bottle. It was dark, almost black, with a distinctive fluted shape. Droplets of water traced paths down its cool surface. With a flick of a Zippo lighter, he popped the metal cap. The hiss it made was sharp, a tiny punctuation mark in the heavy silence of the afternoon. He held it out to the farmer. The old man, whose life was a testament to scarcity, looked at the offering with deep suspicion. His world was one of things earned. Rice from the earth, water from the well. Unsolicited gifts from armed strangers were not gifts. They were transactions, the opening moves in a game whose rules he did not understand. He saw the dark liquid, the fizzing bubbles that rose to the surface. He saw the casualness with which it was offered. This was not water. It was not tea. It was not nuoc, ma'am. It was something else entirely. Hesitantly, he took the bottle. It was cold, shockingly cold, a miracle in the oppressive heat. He brought it to his lips, tilted it back, and took a sip. And in that moment, the war changed. It was not a change marked by an explosion or a command. It was a change that occurred on the level of sensory input. A cascade of signals fired in the farmer's brain. An intense, cloying sweetness, unlike the subtle sweetness of sugarcane. A strange, sharp bite from the carbonation that pricked his tongue. A complex, spicy flavor that had no analog in his entire culinary experience. He did not know what he was drinking. He did not know it was called Coca-Cola. He did not know that the bottle in his hand was one of 25 million that would be consumed in this country this month. He did not know that its journey to his village represented a logistical feat more complex than many of the military operations that raged around him. What he knew was this: the people who could make such a thing, who could keep it cold in the middle of this heat, and who could give it away for free as if it were nothing, they were not from his world. They were from another planet entirely. He was witnessing the arrival of a weapon disguised as a soft drink, a weapon that would systematically dismantle his understanding of the enemy, and in doing so, reveal the profound, unbridgeable chasm between two competing systems. The war in Vietnam was meant to be a contest of wills. It was a battle of ideology, of nationalism, of endurance. It was pitched as a struggle between the righteous determination of a united people and the decadent materialism of a foreign invader. The propaganda broadcast from Hanoi and whispered in the villages was clear. The Americans were soft. They were capitalists, corrupted by comfort and lacking the stomach for a long, grinding fight. The strength of the revolution lay in its purity, its austerity, its ability to endure hardship. The Viet Cong soldier's life was a testament to this creed. His daily ration was a ball of rice, perhaps some dried fish or a foraging of jungle vegetables. His canteen held untreated water, scooped from a stream or a bomb crater. His weapon was meticulously maintained because it was irreplaceable. His ammunition was counted, every single round a precious resource carried for hundreds of miles on the backs of his comrades. Scarcity was the central organizing principle of his existence. Every decision was governed by conservation. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was superfluous. This philosophy was not just a necessity. It was a proclaimed virtue. It was proof of their moral superiority. General von Nguyen Giap, the architect of North Vietnam's military strategy, built his entire doctrine on this foundation. He would trade 10 of his lives for one of the enemy's, not out of cruelty, but from a cold calculation of resources. The Vietnamese resource was people and their will to sacrifice. The American resource was material and their unwillingness to expend it. It was a war of spirit against steel, of the peasant against the machine. Into this stark, ascetic world of revolutionary struggle, the Americans brought Coca-Cola. It was not part of an official psychological operations program. There was no military directive titled Operation Refreshment. It arrived simply because the American soldier wanted it. It was a taste of home, a small, 10-cent comfort in a world of discomfort and fear. It was a break from the chlorinated water in his canteen, a ritual that connected him back to a life of drive-in movies and summer afternoons. The United States military, an organization built to project power, understood that the morale of its soldiers was a critical component of that power. And if keeping a soldier happy meant shipping a carbonated beverage 8,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, then that is what it would do. Robert Woodruff, the legendary president of the Coca-Cola Company, had made a promise during World War II. He had declared that we will see that every man in uniform gets a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents. Wherever he is and whatever it cost the company, this was not just patriotism. It was a stroke of marketing genius. It cemented Coke as an inextricable part of the American identity. That promise was renewed for Korea, and it was renewed again for Vietnam. The first trickles of the beverage arrived with the initial American advisors. But as the commitment escalated from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands of troops, the trickle became a flood. The logistical challenge was immense. At first, it was all imported, bottled in the Philippines or Guam, and shipped to the massive American bases at Cam Ranh Bay and Da Nang. But this was inefficient. It was expensive. It took up valuable space on cargo ships that could be used for ammunition and spare parts. The solution was simple and, in its simplicity, utterly audacious. If you can't ship it, build it. In 1966, the Coca-Cola Company, with the full cooperation of the Department of Defense, began constructing bottling plants directly in South Vietnam. They were not built in the relative safety of the capital alone. A plant rose in Saigon, a sprawling, modern facility. Another was built in Da Nang, right in the heart of I Corps, the most heavily contested military region in the country. More followed. These were not makeshift operations. They were state-of-the-art factories, complete with American machinery, water purification systems, and carbonation equipment, staffed by local Vietnamese workers under American management. The ideological war had met the industrial one. The initial shock for the Vietnamese who witnessed this was one of profound cognitive dissonance. The propaganda they had been fed for years portrayed America as a failing state, a paper tiger, in the words of Mao Zedong, bogged down in internal conflict and economic decay. The reality they saw was a nation so wealthy, so powerful, that it could afford to build factories for a non-essential luxury item in the middle of a war zone. A local contractor hired to work on the Saigon plant site recounted his confusion. He asked an American engineer what they were building. "A Coca-Cola factory," the engineer replied. The contractor was baffled. He knew what factories were for. They made weapons, or uniforms, or tires for trucks. They made things for the war. The idea of building one to make a sweet drink seemed like a form of madness. It was a level of priority that defied all logic. The American engineer just shrugged. The guys need their Cokes. That casual statement, "the guys need their Cokes," was more devastating to the revolutionary ideology than 1,000 propaganda leaflets. It revealed a fundamental truth that Hanoi's leadership desperately tried to conceal. The American definition of need was so far removed from the Vietnamese definition that they might as well have been different species. For a Viet Cong soldier, need was another handful of rice to keep marching, another clip of ammunition for his rifle. For the American soldier, need included a cold, refreshing beverage at the end of a long patrol. And the American system was powerful enough to satisfy it. The numbers told the story. By 1967, the plant in Saigon alone was producing over 10 million bottles of Coca-Cola and other soft drinks every single month. The Da Nang plant added millions more to that total. This was not a trickle, it was a deluge. A river of dark, sugary liquid flowing through the veins of the American military presence. Let us consider the logistics of a single bottle. First, the syrup. The secret Formula 7X concentrate was manufactured in the United States. It was shipped in sealed canisters across the Pacific. These canisters were not just cargo. They were strategic assets, moved with the same care as sensitive military hardware. Then the water. The local water supply was unsafe to drink. So each bottling plant had its own industrial-grade, multi-stage purification system, using sand filters, activated charcoal, and chlorination to produce water purer than anything available to the vast majority of the Vietnamese population. This technology, commonplace in any American city, was a marvel of engineering in a place like Da Nang. Next, carbonation. This required carbon dioxide gas, which had to be produced or imported and stored in pressurized tanks. Another layer of industrial complexity. Finally, the bottles themselves. Glass was heavy and inefficient. Initially, vast quantities of empty bottles were shipped to Vietnam, a logistical nightmare. The company quickly invested in local glass manufacturing and robust recycling programs, paying Vietnamese children a few piastres for every empty bottle they returned. This created a microeconomy centered entirely on the American thirst for soda. Entire villages became part of the Coca-Cola supply chain. Once bottled, the product had to be moved. It flowed through the official military supply chain. Cases of Coke were loaded onto deuce-and-a-half trucks and driven in convoys, sharing the road with ammunition carriers and troop transports. They were loaded onto C-130 Hercules transport planes and flown into major airfields. They were slung in cargo nets beneath the bellies of CH-47 Chinook helicopters and delivered directly to remote firebases perched on lonely hilltops. A soldier sitting on a sandbag bunker at Khe Sanh, one of the most besieged and isolated combat bases of the entire war, could be handed a Coke that was still cold from the factory. The Viet Cong soldier watching the helicopter arrive through his binoculars would see it as a delivery of vital supplies. He would assume it carried mortars, medicine, radio batteries. He could not possibly conceive that a significant portion of that precious cargo space, of that helicopter's flight time, of its jet fuel consumption, was dedicated to a soft drink. If he had known, he might have laid down his arms right then. How can you defeat an enemy who can afford to airdrop soda into a siege? This was the dawning horror that seeped into the consciousness of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. It was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping realization built from thousands of small observations. A Viet Cong sapper, infiltrating a sprawling American base like Long Binh, will be tasked with destroying fuel depots or ammunition dumps. But on his way, he would pass mountains of discarded trash. In these mountains, he would see not just food tins and equipment packaging, but thousands upon thousands of empty Coca-Cola cans and bottles. The Americans did not just consume this luxury. They consumed it in such quantities that its refuse became a geological feature of their bases. The sheer volume of this waste was a more powerful statement than any banner or loudspeaker announcement. A society that could throw this much away was a society operating on a level of production that was simply unimaginable. In his village, an empty bottle was a prized possession, used for storing water or oil. Here, they were bulldozed into pits. The psychological demolition happened at every level. When a Viet Cong fighter was captured, he was often interrogated, processed, and sent to a prisoner of war camp. He expected hardship. He expected deprivation. What he often got instead was his first Coca-Cola. A camp guard would hand him a can, not as a trick, but because they were everywhere. The prisoner, who had spent months or years living on the absolute margins of survival, will be given the same drink the guards themselves consumed casually. Bao Ninh, who served in the North Vietnamese army and later wrote the acclaimed novel The Sorrow of War, described the feeling. He spoke not of Coke specifically, but of the general, overwhelming sense of American material superiority. He wrote of capturing an American position and finding it littered with love letters, expensive cameras, tape recorders, and colored shirts. His own soldiers had nothing but their weapons and the clothes on their backs. He described the feeling as a spiritual wound, a sudden, gut-wrenching understanding that they were not fighting soldiers like themselves. They were fighting a different kind of civilization. A captured NVA officer, in a post-war interview, explained the feeling more bluntly. We were trained to think of the Americans as soft, as cowboys who were not serious soldiers. Then we saw their bases. They were like cities. They had air conditioning and ice cream. We knew we were in for a very, very long fight. We knew we could not win in their way. We could only win if they got tired. The drink became a symbol. For the American GI, it was a symbol of home. It was the taste of normalcy in a world of chaos. A first lieutenant with the 1st Cavalry Division wrote in a letter to his parents, "You wouldn't believe it. We were on patrol deep in the Ashau Valley, as far from civilization as you can get. A chopper dropped mail and resupplies, and in the supply net was a case of Cokes, still cold. I sat there on a log, covered in mud and leeches, drinking a Coca-Cola. It was the most surreal and wonderful moment of my tour. For the South Vietnamese, it was a symbol of the modern world. Drinking a Coke was a small act of participation in the global, American-led culture. In the cafes of Saigon, it became a fashionable drink, a sign of sophistication. For a people caught between a rigid, traditional past and an uncertain, violent present, it represented a possible future. A future of consumer choice, of convenience, of industrial plenty. And for the enemy, it became a symbol of everything they were up against. It was a symbol of a bottomless industrial capacity. Any nation that could devote so much energy to producing and distributing a frivolous beverage was a nation whose factories could surely produce an infinite supply of bombs, bullets, and helicopters. It was a symbol of logistical supremacy. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was a triumph of human endurance, a testament to the will of hundreds of thousands of porters carrying supplies on their backs and bicycles through miles of jungle. But it could not compete with the American trail of cargo ships, C-130s and Chinooks. The North Vietnamese measured their logistical capacity in tons per month. The Americans measured theirs in tens of thousands of tons per day. And some of those tons were Coca-Cola. It was a symbol of a profound cultural difference. The revolutionary cause was built on the idea of collective sacrifice. The individual was subordinate to the group. The American system, as evidenced by the Coke bottle, seemed to be built on the idea of individual comfort and satisfaction. The entire, colossal weight of the American military-industrial complex could be leveraged to satisfy the minor thirst of a single soldier. This was not a sign of weakness, as their propaganda claimed. It was a sign of terrifying, world-altering power. The irony was that the Viet Cong and NVA tried to use this very symbol against the Americans. Their propaganda leaflets sometimes depicted fat, lazy American soldiers drinking Coke while Vietnamese peasants starved. But the message backfired. For the Vietnamese person who had actually seen the American presence, the leaflet confirmed not American weakness, but American abundance. The image did not inspire anger. It inspired a grudging awe. The contrast was everywhere, and it was stark. A Viet Cong medic would perform surgery with a rusty knife and no anesthetic, his patient biting on a bamboo stick to stifle the screams. His counterpart in an American field hospital worked in a sterile, air-conditioned tent with a full range of drugs, clean bandages, and refrigerated blood plasma. And after a difficult procedure, the American surgeon could relax with an ice-cold Coke. An NVA truck driver on the Ho Chi Minh Trail would spend weeks navigating a bombed-out jungle path, his truck meticulously camouflaged, running only at night, his fuel rationed by the leader. An American truck driver in a convoy from Da Nang to Phu Bai complained if the reefer unit on the food truck broke down and the Cokes got warm. The war was a collision of two realities, and the Coca-Cola bottle was the point of impact. Think of the energy expenditure. The B, 52 bomber was the ultimate expression of American industrial might, an instrument of almost biblical destruction. A single sortie from Guam to Vietnam consumed tens of thousands of gallons of jet fuel. It was a projection of power on an awesome scale. But in its own way, the delivery of a single case of Coca-Cola to a remote firebase was just as profound an expression of that same power. The fuel burned by the tanker ship crossing the Pacific, the electricity powering the bottling plant, the diesel consumed by the truck in the convoy, the jet fuel burned by the helicopter making the final delivery. The cumulative energy required to place that one bottle in that one soldier's hand was astronomical. It was an expenditure of resources that the North Vietnamese economy could not even begin to comprehend, let alone match. And the Americans did it millions of times a month. This was not a war of tactics. It was a war of logistics. It was a war of production. It was a war of systems. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, famously pursued a strategy of attrition. His goal was to inflict casualties on the enemy at a rate faster than they could be replaced. This strategy is often criticized for being crude and unimaginative, but it was rooted in a deep, implicit understanding of the industrial disparity between the two sides. Westmoreland knew he was managing a system of near-infinite material output. He was waging war with the full power of the American economy at his back. His counterpart, General Giap, was a master of asymmetric warfare. He knew he could never match the Americans plane for plane or tank for tank. His strategy was one of attrition as well, but he was attriting something else, American will. He believed that if he could just hang on, just inflict enough casualties, just make the war painful enough for long enough, the decadent, comfort-loving Americans would eventually tire and go home. The Coca-Cola bottle was the flaw in his logic. It proved that the Americans were not decadent in a way that made them weak. Their materialism was the very source of their strength. Their ability to mass-produce comfort was merely the civilian expression of their ability to mass-produce the tools of war. A system that could build a bottling plant in Da Nang could also build a new B-52 in Seattle. A supply chain that could deliver cold soda to Key San could also deliver an endless stream of 105mm howitzer shells. The point of no return, the moment of ideological collapse, was not a single event. It was a creeping, pervasive realization. It was the NBA soldier who, after overrunning an American firebase, found not a desperate, starving garrison, but abandoned coolers still stocked with Cokes and beer. It was the local village chief who saw American Seabees build a concrete schoolhouse in a week, a feat of construction that would have taken his village a decade, and then watched them celebrate the grand opening by handing out cold soft drinks to all the children. The concession came years later, in the quiet reflections of memoirs and interviews. Truong New Tang, a former Viet Cong Minister of Justice, wrote in his memoir about the sheer, demoralizing effect of American wealth. He described the moment he realized the war was unwinnable in a conventional sense. It was not a battle that convinced him. It was the sight of the endless river of American supplies, the casual, thoughtless abundance that permeated every aspect of their presence. We had to pinch ourselves to believe it was not a dream, a former NVA colonel said, describing his first view of the port of Da Nang after the war. He saw the vast concrete piers, the enormous warehouses, the skeletons of the American logistical machine. The Americans were the most powerful country in the world. We knew it. We just hoped they didn't have the stomach to use that power. But they did use it. They used it to build airfields and ports. They used it to deploy 500,000 men. They used it to drop more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped by all sides in World War II. And they used it to ensure that those men, no matter how far from home, could have a Coca-Cola. The final, staggering numbers are a testament to this reality. By the end of the American involvement in Vietnam, the military had facilitated the consumption of well over 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola. 5 billion. That is not a typo. That is a number so vast it becomes abstract. It is a number that represents a victory of a different kind. The United States may not have won the war in Vietnam. It did not achieve its political objectives. The fall of Saigon in 1975 is a historical fact. But in the war between systems, the war of ideas, the war of production and logistics, the outcome was never in doubt. The Coca-Cola bottle was the victor. It did not carry a payload of high explosives. It did not fire a single bullet. But it shattered the core premise of the enemy's ideology. It proved that the paper tiger had industrial teeth of hardened steel. It demonstrated that American materialism was not a weakness, but a weapon of unimaginable scale. It showed a generation of Vietnamese people on both sides of the conflict that the world of the Americans was a world of almost magical abundance. In the years after the war, as Vietnam slowly opened its economy to the world, one of the first American companies to return was not a defense contractor or an oil giant. It was Coca-Cola. They built new bottling plants. The iconic red and white logo began to appear on billboards in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. For a new generation of Vietnamese, it was no longer a symbol of a foreign army. It became, as it was for so much of the world, a symbol of global commerce, of modernity, of a future their parents had fought and died to prevent. The old farmer from Dai Ban is likely long gone. The young Marine from Ohio is now a grandfather. The world they inhabited, that world of heat and dust and confusion, has faded into history. But the legacy of that moment, of that simple, impossible transaction, remains. It is the story of how a war of ideology was ultimately decided by a war of logistics. It is the story of how the most effective piece of propaganda was not a leaflet, but a 10-ounce bottle of carbonated sugar water. It is the story of a system so powerful, so overwhelmingly productive, that could fight a brutal, decade-long war on the other side of the planet and never, not for one single day, run out of Coke. They did not beat them on the battlefield, not in the end. They buried them in bottles. They drowned them in abundance. They showed them a world they could not possibly compete with, a world that could produce and deliver a simple comfort with a relentless, terrifying efficiency. And that revelation, that dawning, soul-crushing understanding, is a defeat from which no ideology can ever truly recover. The war was lost by America, but the argument was won by Coca-Cola.